Hello, it's me, 32-Bits. Welcome to Spellbound, your CD32-centric all things retro show. On today's episode, part 2 of the eBay as-is Amiga 1200 restoration. If you haven't already seen part 1, you might want to check that out first. There'll be a link in the description below. Let's go. So, I have the parts for the recap on order, and while I wait for them to arrive, first thing I want to address is this case. I want to see if I can get all the paint off and get it in a usable state before I continue with the motherboard in part 3. I can buy a replacement case, but I really would like to save it if I can. Big thank you, by the way, for all your suggestions regarding paint removal. I don't really have a lot of experience with stripping paint from plastic. Didn't have to resort to sandblasting though, but it was on the list of things to try if all else failed. The first thing I tried was 91% isopropyl alcohol. I tried soaking a section in it, and I also tried scrubbing with it, but it had little effect on the purple paint armor. Then I tried acetone, and it immediately stripped the paint off, but also it wanted to melt the plastic underneath. So I decided I'd try something that I've used before on furniture. It's this stuff, citrus strip. Now, I want to pause for a second and give a disclaimer. I know that plastic isn't listed on the container. It says wood, metal, masonry. So I don't recommend that you try this on your vintage computer. I don't know what the long-term effects might be, and I am by no means an expert on plastics. So don't use this on your plastic to get paint off. And lastly, whenever you're using chemicals, make sure you wear the proper protective equipment and you're allowing for good ventilation. You'll hear the fan noise in the background. Sorry for that, but again, gotta have the ventilation. Okay, that out of the way, I ended up using it on the case. I started with a small section on the side, and left the gel on for about 40 seconds and then wiped it off. It was only taking off one layer at a time, and I was okay with that. Here you can see that there are actually 3 layers of paint on this case. There's a dark blue, a light blue, and then purple. The first layer, the bottom layer, is very hard. It's a very hard paint. And the top layer is a softer paint, and it's coming off much easier. Now that I've tested on this small section, it's time to get to work on the rest of the case. I'm applying a very thin coat as evenly as I can and waiting about 40 seconds, and you can see the paint starting to wrinkle. Then the first layer wipes off pretty easily, and I continue this process over and over to get as much of the paint off as I can. It actually worked out pretty good. I got the first couple of layers off, and then I re-gelled and I started using a scraper. I would hold the scraper as flat as possible to the surface and slowly pushing it along. I'm not applying any downward pressure. I'm just letting the scraper push the paint off. It looks a little more destructive than it is. It's not actually scratching the plastic. It's just scraping the paint off. I repeated this process on the entire surface of the case, and it did a pretty good job. Here, I'm taking a brush and I'm going to be brushing into the letters of the Amiga logo on the front of the case. It's caked with paint. On top of the 3 layers, whoever had this case then went ahead and added some other colors into the Amiga. So I put some gel on there and immediately just started, brushing it in. I'm using a kind of a stiffer bristle brush here, and I'm trying to get into the corners, and then using a paper towel to wipe it out. Then I continued that technique over the rest of the case. Gel, stiff brush, paper towel, until I had all but the most stubborn of paint off. After a rinse with clean water, the case came out pretty good. The only thing left was some really stubborn spots, in the corners and cracks and crevices that I really couldn't get to. And I didn't want to leave the gel on too long. I was afraid it might damage the plastic. So I decided that the best thing would probably be to mechanically remove the rest of the paint. So I turned to a tool that I've used often with 3D printing, these nail files. They come in packs of 5. I get them at the dollar store. They come in varying grits, and I get the finest one for this kind of job. And it just allows me to get at that paint in these corners here and scrape that off. When you're doing 3D print, it's good to get into small areas and do smoothing and prep the piece for paint. So I'm just using water here. After I've scraped an area, then I'm just going to spray it down with water just to rinse off any of the particles of paint that come off. I'm using an old towel like that on the table just to catch any of the little paint flecks. And also the water helps keep any dust down. Just keep everything super wet, and you don't have to worry about any dust. And it makes for a finer finish as well. Now that I've had to mechanically remove some of this paint with these nail files, I'm thinking I may have to paint the case. I'm also noticing there's some damage. It may have been one of the reasons the case was painted originally. There's some cracks on the back here. And the original blue paint, it's kind of seeped into that crack, and there's really not going to be any way for me to get rid of this blue veining that's happening in these cracks. So I may end up having to put a top coat on this. I'll know better once I get all of the paint that's left in the very smallest of crevices out. So for the last bits of paint, I'm going to use these tools. These are some picks, and I'm going to just gently scrape and pick out the very last bits of this paint. Along the sides here, I run this pointed pick along the side. It's a hard steel, so as I bump into the paint, it kind of chips off. I'm not gouging the plastic, I'm just pushing up against the paint, and the paint is dry. It's really hard. Like I was saying in the beginning, it's very hard, but it's also brittle, so when I hit it with the hard steel, it kind of just chips off, and you can see the little flecks of paint there. That's why I want to keep this wet, so these little flecks of paint stay on the towel here. And now to finish up, I'm just going to get into this Amiga logo here, get rid of all these tiny little bits of paint that are stuck along there, and really clean it up nicely. Okay, now that the top of the case has had all its paint removed, every speck of paint is gone, I'm going to turn my attention to the bottom of the case. Looking at the bottom of the case, you can see it's very yellowed. Same with the keys. Going to start off by washing the bottom case and the keys in some dish detergent in the sink. here on the bottom are really grungy, so I'm going to use some magic eraser on those. It helps to scuff up the rubber and get the grime and grease off. Now that everything's cleaned up, I can start the retrobriting process. So they're going to go into some peroxide. I just use the regular liquid stuff to do my retrobriting. The keys are going to go in a Ziploc bag, and the bottom of the case will go in a clear tub, and I'll leave those out in the sun for pretty much the whole day. I'll check the bag of keys and rotate that every so often. Same with the tub. I'll rotate that in the sun so all the sides of the case will get some sunlight. Okay, so they've had about a full day in the sun. Let's take them out and see how they come out. Yeah, and those turned out pretty good. There's still a tiny bit of yellowing, but I'm totally fine with the way they came out. I'm actually really happy with it. And the bottom half of the case looks really good. Wow, this looks really good. Here's a before and after. Right? That looks so much better. And now the back of the case still does have some discoloring. It's not quite perfect, but it's a great improvement over what it was, and I'm happy with that result too. So that's the top of the case done, the bottom of the case done, and the keys done. Time to put the keys back on and see what that looks like. Okay, here's the before and after of the keys. I think you'd agree the after is much better. And now here's the case all back together. Here's the final result. Motherboard's still out of it, but you get a really good sense of what it looks like now. Here's the before and after. The top of the case, I did end up putting a top coat on. The couple of cracks that were in it just showed off that blue paint too much. I think I matched it pretty well. Don't know if I'm going to spray the bottom of the case. I think it looks pretty good the way it is now. It's certainly a great improvement over what it was. So now I'm ready to move on to the inside of the machine and start troubleshooting the mouse movement and get that hard drive sorted out too. I need to do a recap yet, and there's a couple other things I want to do still, cosmetically. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Thanks again for watching, and have a great day.